The Billionaire Tycoon saw the drawing. It was identical to one made by his lost son. The mahogany doors of the Hartwell Foundation's Manhattan headquarters gleamed under the autumn morning light, filtering through the 32nd floor windows. Richard Hartwell, worth $3 billion according to Forbes's latest count, sat behind his expansive desk reviewing grant proposals with the methodical precision that had built his empire from a single construction company into a multinational conglomerate. At 58, Richard's silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccable, and his steel gray eyes held the sharp focus of a man who hadn't taken a day off in 15 years. The Hartwell Foundation, established after his divorce, was his attempt at legacy, funding art programs in underprivileged communities across America. It was, his therapist had suggested, a way to channel his guilt into something productive. Mr. Hartwell, his assistant Margaret knocked and entered without waiting. As she had for the past decade, the submissions from the Chicago Arts Initiative have arrived. They're quite remarkable this year. She placed a thick manila folder on his desk, filled with photographs and sketches from children in the Southside Community Center the foundation had been supporting. Richard nodded absently, already turning his attention to the quarterly reports that demanded his immediate review. Margaret knew better than to expect enthusiasm. Richard approached charity with the same businesslike detachment he applied to mergers and acquisitions. 2 hours later, with the reports completed and 3 conference calls behind him, Richard finally opened the Chicago folder. The first few submissions were typical: colorful paintings of houses and families, stick figures holding hands under smiling suns. He flipped through them with professional interest, making mental notes about which programs were showing the most promise for continued funding. Then he saw it. His hand froze mid-turn. The pencil sketch, drawn on standard white paper, showed a lighthouse standing on a rocky cliff overlooking a turbulent sea. The technique was sophisticated for a child's work. The shading around the lighthouse beam created depth. The waves were rendered with careful attention to movement and texture. But it wasn't the artistic skill that made Richard's breath catch in his throat. It was the signature in the bottom right corner: Tommy, age 8, and the unmistakable detail that made his hands tremble. A small sailboat in the distance, tilted, at the exact angle that suggested it was riding the wind, its single sail marked with a tiny crescent moon. Richard's mind catapulted back 18 years to a similar drawing, created by another Tommy at age 8. His son, Thomas Hartwell, who had drawn that same lighthouse, that same tilted sailboat with its crescent moon sail, during their last vacation together in Maine. The drawing that had hung on their Westchester refrigerator until the day his ex-wife, Claire, had packed up Thomas and moved to Seattle, taking their 7-year-old son away from him forever. The custody battle had been bitter and public. Claire, armed with evidence of his 18-hour workdays and frequent business trips, had convinced the judge that Thomas needed stability, not a father who treated parenting like another item on his corporate agenda. Richard's lawyers had fought hard, but the damage was done. Within 6 months, Claire had remarried a Boeing engineer named Marcus Peterson and legally changed Thomas's name to Thomas Peterson. Richard had tried to maintain contact, flying to Seattle twice a month, but the calls became less frequent, the visits more strained. Thomas grew distant, resentful of the disruption to his new life. By the time Thomas turned 12, he had stopped taking Richard's calls altogether. Claire's lawyer had made it clear any further attempts at contact would be considered harassment. The last communication Richard had received was a brief note on Thomas's 16th birthday, written in careful handwriting. "Please stop sending money. I don't need anything from you. I have a real father now." That had been 10 years ago. Richard had honored his son's wishes, channeling his paternal energy into building his business empire and eventually into the foundation that bore his name. He told himself that if Thomas ever wanted to reconnect, he knew where to find him. The Hartwell name was splashed across enough business magazines and charity galas that a simple Google search would lead Thomas straight to his door. Now, staring at this drawing that seemed to mock him with its impossible similarity, Richard felt something crack open in his chest. The lighthouse, the sailboat, even the way the clouds were sketched in the upper right corner. It was as if Thomas had reached across time and distance to place this drawing directly in his father's hands. Richard reached for his phone with shaking fingers, then stopped. Margaret would think he was losing his mind. Hell, maybe he was. Successful businessmen didn't hallucinate connections between random children's artwork and their estranged sons. But the crescent moon on that tiny sail seemed to glow under his desk lamp, and Richard knew with absolute certainty that this was no coincidence. He buzzed Margaret's extension. "Cancel my 2 o'clock, he said, his voice hoarser than he intended, "and book me a morning flight to Chicago. I need to visit the Southside Arts Initiative personally." For the first time in 18 years, Richard Hartwell was about to chase something more important than a profit margin. The Southwest Airlines flight from LaGuardia to O'Hare was a humbling experience for a man accustomed to private jets. Richard sat in seat 12B, wedged between a college student with headphones and an elderly woman knitting what appeared to be a Christmas sweater in October. He kept the manila folder containing the drawing on his lap, occasionally opening it to stare at the sketch that had upended his carefully ordered world. The taxi ride from O'Hare to the South Side took 45 minutes through Chicago's labyrinthine traffic. Richard watched the city transform as they moved away from the gleaming downtown loop, the architecture shifting from glass and steel to brick and mortar, the streets narrowing, the faces becoming more diverse. This wasn't the Chicago he knew from business dinners at the Four Seasons or charity galas at the Art Institute. This was working-class America, the kind of neighborhood where a billionaire's surprise visit might be met with suspicion rather than reverence. The Southside Arts Initiative occupied a converted warehouse on 47th Street, its brick facade painted with a colorful mural depicting children of various ethnicities holding paintbrushes and musical instruments. Hand-painted signs in English and Spanish welcomed visitors to a place where creativity grows. Richard's Italian leather shoes felt out of place on the cracked sidewalk as he approached the glass entrance doors. Inside, the space buzzed with controlled chaos. Children ranging from 6 to 16 worked at easels and tables scattered throughout the main room, their voices creating a symphony of concentration and collaboration. The smell of acrylic paint mixed with the aroma of something cooking in what Richard assumed was a kitchen area. This wasn't the sterile, quiet environment of the Manhattan galleries he frequented. This was art in its rawest, most joyful form. "Can I help you?" A woman in her early 30s approached him, her curly black hair pulled back with what appeared to be a paintbrush. Her jeans were splattered with various colors, and her smile was genuinely warm despite the obvious curiosity in her eyes. Few men in $1,000 suits wandered into community art centers on Tuesday afternoons. "I'm Richard Hartwell, from the Hartwell Foundation," he said, extending his hand. "I was hoping to speak with someone about your recent grant submission." The woman's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Sophia Martinez, the program director. We weren't expecting, we usually work through your foundation staff." She shook his hand with paint-stained fingers. "Is everything all right with our application?" Richard pulled the folder from under his arm. "Actually, I wanted to ask about one of the submissions, a drawing by someone named Tommy." He opened the folder carefully, as if the sketch might dissolve if handled too roughly. "This lighthouse scene. Do you know which child created it?" Sophia studied the drawing, her expression shifting from confusion to something Richard couldn't quite identify. "Oh," she said quietly. "You mean Tommy Chen. He's not technically one of our regular students." "What do you mean?" Sophia glanced around the busy room, then gestured toward a quieter corner near a window overlooking the street. "Tommy doesn't live in the neighborhood," she explained as they walked. "He comes here 3 times a week after school, takes 2 buses to get here. His foster mother drops him off when she can, but usually he makes the trip alone." Richard felt his stomach tighten. "Foster mother? His name is Tommy Chen now, but..." Sophia hesitated, studying Richard's face. "Mr. Hartwell, Can I ask why you're specifically interested in this drawing? We get hundreds of submissions, and I've never seen a foundation director make a personal visit over one piece. Richard looked down at the sketch again. The lighthouse seemed to pulse with significance under the afternoon light streaming through the warehouse windows. Around them, children continued their artistic endeavors, oblivious to the conversation that might change everything. The drawing, Richard said carefully, is identical to one my son made 18 years ago. My son, who I lost custody of when he was 7. His name was Thomas. Sophia's intake of breath was sharp. Thomas Peterson, she whispered. The world seemed to stop. Richard's legs felt unsteady and he gripped the back of a nearby chair. You know that name? Tommy told me his original name was Thomas Peterson. He said his mother died in a car accident 2 years ago, and his stepfather, well, Marcus Peterson couldn't handle raising someone else's child alone. Tommy's been in the system since then, bouncing between foster homes. Sophia's voice was gentle but direct. Mr. Hartwell, how common is the name Thomas Peterson? Richard's mind raced through the implications. If Thomas had kept Marcus's last name, if Claire was dead, if his son was now in foster care. Where is he now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He should be here in about an hour. Tuesday is one of his regular days. Sophia studied Richard's face intently. But Mr. Hartwell, I need to ask, if you're his biological father, why hasn't he been placed with you? The system always tries to place children with family members first. The answer was devastating in its simplicity. Because he changed his name legally when he was 7. Because I don't exist in any of his official records as Thomas Peterson's father. Because the system doesn't know I exist. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, watching the children around them create their small masterpieces. Finally, she turned, back to Richard. He's a good kid, she said. Quiet, talented, but angry, really angry. And he's been hurt enough, Mr. Hartwell. If you're here to play some kind of game. I'm here because I've spent every day of the last 18 years wondering if my son was safe and happy. Richard interrupted. I'm here because I honored his wishes to leave him alone. And now I find out he's been alone in ways I never imagined. The sound of children's laughter filled the space between them. Richard clutched the drawing tighter. This piece of paper that had somehow bridged an impossible gap between his past mistakes and his chance for redemption. What do I need to do? He asked. Sophia looked at him for a long moment, then pulled out her phone. First we wait. Tommy needs to decide if he wants to see you. But Mr. Hartwell, she met his eyes directly. Don't expect this to be easy. He's not the 7-year-old you remember. At 4:17 p.m., Richard watched through the warehouse window as a city bus wheezed to a stop across the street. Several passengers disembarked, but his attention focused on a tall, lanky teenager with sandy brown hair who stepped down from the rear exit. Even from a distance, even after 18 years, Richard recognized the way his son walked. A slightly hurried gait, shoulders hunched forward as if bracing against the world. Tommy, looked both exactly as Richard had imagined and completely different. He'd inherited his father's height and his mother's delicate bone structure, but there was something in his posture that spoke of guardedness, of a young man who had learned not to expect good things. He wore a faded Chicago Bulls hoodie, jeans with carefully patched knees, and carried a backpack that had seen better years. That's him, Sophia said quietly, appearing beside Richard at the window. Are you ready for this? Richard's mouth was dry. 18 years of wondering, of imagining this moment, had not prepared him for the reality of seeing his son cross the street toward the building where he waited. What did you tell him? That someone wanted to meet him about his drawing. Nothing. More. Sophia's expression was protective. I figured you both deserved the chance to handle this however felt right. Tommy pushed through the glass doors, and the similarity was even more striking up close. He had Richard's gray eyes and Claire's expressive eyebrows, but his face held a wariness that belonged entirely to his own experiences. He scanned the room, clearly looking for Sophia, and when his gaze passed over Richard, There was no recognition, just the polite disinterest of a teenager encountering another adult in his space. "Hey, Sophia," Tommy called out, dropping his backpack near his usual easel. "Mrs. Garcia said you wanted to see me about something." Sophia glanced at Richard, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Tommy, there's someone here who saw your lighthouse. Drawing, he'd like to talk to you about it." Tommy's expression shifted to mild confusion. "My drawing, why?" He looked around until his eyes landed on Richard, who was standing frozen near the window, still clutching the manila folder. "Is there some kind of problem?" Richard forced himself to move forward, each step feeling like it carried the weight of nearly 2 decades. When he reached Tommy, he could see the exact shade of gray in his son's eyes that he remembered from bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. "Hello, Tommy," Richard said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "My name is Richard Hartwell." The name clearly meant nothing to Tommy, who looked between Richard and Sophia with growing confusion. "Okay," he said carefully. "Nice to meet you, I guess. Sophia said you wanted to talk about my drawing?" Richard opened the folder with hands that barely trembled. "This drawing," he said, showing Tommy the lighthouse sketch. "It's remarkable work." Tommy glanced at the paper, then back at Richard. "Thanks, but I don't really understand why." "The lighthouse," Richard continued, his voice catching slightly, "and the sailboat with the crescent moon. It's very specific imagery, very personal." Something flickered in Tommy's eyes, a flash of wariness that hadn't been there before. "It's just a drawing," he said, but his voice had changed, become more guarded. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With fingers that shook slightly, he scrolled through his photos until he found the one he'd taken years ago, a picture of Claire's refrigerator, with Thomas's original lighthouse drawing held up by alphabet magnets. He held the phone out to Tommy, who took it automatically. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours. Tommy stared at the photo, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been fear. When he looked up at Richard, his eyes held a completely different quality. Not the polite distance of a moment before, but something raw and vulnerable. "I know who you are," Tommy said quietly. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "You remember me?" "I remember the lighthouse," Tommy said, still holding the phone. "We drew it together. In Maine, you taught me how to shade the rocks." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You're my father." Around them, the normal sounds of the art center continued. Children laughing, paintbrushes tapping against water cups, the distant sound of someone tuning a guitar. But in the bubble that had formed around Richard and Tommy, the world had narrowed to just this moment, this recognition, this impossible reunion. "I've been looking for you," Richard said, though that wasn't entirely true. I've been thinking about you every day for 18 years. Tommy handed the phone back, his expression hardening. "Thinking about me, but not looking very hard." There was no anger in his voice, just a matter-of-fact sadness that was somehow worse. "I've been in Chicago for 2 years. In the system. If you'd wanted to find me, you could have." The accusation was gentle but devastating. Richard felt the weight of every business meeting he'd prioritized, every charity gala he'd attended while his son was moving between foster homes in a city 3 hours away by plane. "I didn't know," Richard said. "I didn't know about your mother, about Marcus, about any of it. The last thing you told me was that you didn't want me in your life. I thought you were happy." Tommy's laugh was bitter, but not cruel. "Happy?" he repeated. "Yeah, well, things change." He looked around the art center at the children working on their projects, at Sophia, who was pretending to organize supplies while clearly listening to every word. "Why are you here now?" It was the question Richard had been dreading, because the answer revealed so much about his failures as a father. "Because I saw your drawing in a grant application," he said. "Because I run the foundation that funds this place, and when I saw the lighthouse, I recognized it." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "So you didn't come looking for me," he said finally. "You just found me by accident." Yes, Richard admitted, because there was no point in lying now. But Tommy, if I had known, would... You have come? Tommy interrupted. If you'd known I was in foster care, would you have actually come looking for me? Or would you have just sent money like you always did? The question hung in the air between them, and Richard realized that his answer would determine everything that happened next. Around them, the art center continued its daily rhythm. But he felt as if he and his son were standing at the edge of a cliff, and his next words would determine whether they stepped back to safety or fell into the abyss that had separated them. For so long, I don't know, Richard said finally, choosing honesty over comfort. I'd like to think I would have, but I honestly don't know. Tommy nodded, and for a moment Richard saw a glimpse of the mature young man his son had become. Someone who appreciated honesty, even when it hurt. Okay, Tommy said. So what happens now? The small coffee shop on 53rd Street felt like neutral territory. Richard had suggested dinner at one of Chicago's upscale restaurants, but Tommy had shaken his head and asked if they could just go somewhere quiet to talk. The cafe they'd chosen was nothing special. Mismatched furniture, local artwork on the walls, and the kind of relaxed atmosphere that invited long conversations. They sat across from each other at a corner table, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them. Richard had ordered a black coffee out of habit, while Tommy nursed a hot chocolate with whipped cream, a detail that reminded Richard painfully of the 7-year-old who used to insist on extra marshmallows. Tell me about your life, Richard said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since they'd left the art center. I mean, really tell me, not just the facts. Tommy stirred his hot chocolate, watching the whipped cream dissolve into white spirals. Which part? The part where Mom died? Or the part where Marcus decided he couldn't handle me anymore? Or the part where I've lived in 6 different homes in 2 years? The matter-of-fact tone made Richard's chest tighten. Start wherever you want to start. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then began speaking in the measured way of someone who had learned to guard their emotions carefully. Mom got sick when I was 15. Cancer. It took about 1.5 years. Marcus tried, I guess, but he was dealing with his own grief, and I was just this reminder of her first marriage. When she died, he lasted about 3 months before he called social services. Richard felt anger rise in his throat. Anger at Marcus, at the system, at himself for not somehow knowing. What did you tell them about having other family? What was I supposed to tell them? Tommy met his eyes directly. That I had a biological father who hadn't contacted me in 6 years, who I'd specifically told to leave me alone. The social worker asked if there was anyone else, and I said no. He paused. Because that's what I believed. The weight of his son's words settled over Richard like a physical thing. Every birthday card he hadn't sent, every Christmas that had passed without contact, every time he'd told himself he was respecting Thomas's wishes, it had all led to this moment, to his son believing he was truly alone in the world. I'm sorry, Richard said, and the words felt inadequate. I'm sorry for all of it, for not fighting harder when you were young, for not trying to contact you when you were a teenager, for not somehow knowing when you needed help. Tommy nodded, accepting the apology without dramatically forgiving him. The thing is, he said, I used to be angry about it. Really angry. But anger is exhausting when you're trying to survive, and I needed all my energy for that. Tell me about the foster homes. Tommy's expression darkened slightly. Some were okay, some weren't. The Garcias are good people, that's where I am now. But I know it's temporary. It's always temporary. He looked out the window at the early evening street scene. I'll age out in about 8 months. Then I'm on my own anyway. The casual way, Tommy discussed his future, as if facing homelessness at 18 was just another logistical challenge, made Richard realize how much his son had been forced to grow up in ways that no teenager should have to. What do you want? Richard asked. I mean, for your future, what do you want to do? For the first time since they'd sat down, Tommy's expression brightened slightly. I want to study art. Real art. At a real school. I've been working with Sophia on a portfolio, and she thinks I might be good enough for college. But that costs money I don't have, and my grades aren't perfect because I've moved around so much. Richard felt something shift in his chest. Not the guilt that had been his constant companion, but something that felt like possibility. What if money wasn't an obstacle? Tommy's eyes narrowed. Are you offering to pay for college? Because I need to tell you, that feels weird. Like you're trying to buy your way back into my life. The directness of the observation surprised Richard, but he recognized the intelligence behind it. His son had learned to read people's motivations, probably out of necessity. Maybe I am, Richard admitted, but maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Maybe sometimes practical help is how people show love, especially when they don't know how to show it any other way. Tommy considered this, stirring his hot chocolate again. I don't know you, he said finally. I mean, I remember you from when I was little, but I don't know who you are now, and you don't know me either. You're right. So if we're going to do this, whatever this is, we need to figure out how to know each other. As the people we are now, not as the people we were. Richard felt a surge of respect for his son's maturity. At 17, Tommy was approaching their reunion with more wisdom than Richard had shown at 58. How do we do that? Richard asked. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then pulled out his phone and showed Richard a photograph, a sketch of the Chicago skyline at sunset, drawn with incredible detail and skill. I draw what I see, Tommy said. It's how I process things, how I remember them. If we're going to get to know each other, I need to see who you really are. Not the billionaire guy from the internet, not the father I remember from when I was 7, the actual person. Richard looked at the drawing on Tommy's phone, struck by the realism and emotional depth his son had captured in simple pencil strokes. What would that look like? I don't know yet, Tommy said. But it can't just be you showing up with money and trying to fix everything. It has to be real. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the magnitude of what they were contemplating. Richard realized that his son was offering him something precious. Not forgiveness, not instant reconciliation, but a chance to build something new from the foundation of their shared DNA and their mutual willingness to try. I have a proposal, Richard said finally. Give me 30 days, let me show you who I am now and you show me who you are. No promises about the future, no pressure about what our relationship should look like. Just 30 days of getting to know each other. Tommy met his eyes, and Richard saw Claire's determination mixed with something that was entirely his son's own strength. 30 days, Tommy agreed. But we do this honestly. No performance, no trying to impress each other. Just truth. Richard extended his hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Tommy shook it. It was, Richard realized, the first time he had touched his son in 18 years. Outside the coffee shop window, Chicago continued its evening rhythm, unaware that two lives had just shifted toward each other, across a chasm that had seemed impossible to bridge. 3 weeks into their 30-day agreement, Richard found himself doing something he hadn't done in 15 years, leaving the office early on a Wednesday afternoon. He had picked Tommy up from the art center and driven him to Lincoln Park, where they sat on a bench overlooking the lake, watching sailboats navigate the October wind. Tell me about the lighthouse, Richard said, breaking their comfortable silence. I mean, why you still draw it? Tommy was sketching the boats on the water, his pencil moving with practiced confidence. I never forgot that week in Maine, he said without looking up from his drawing. It was the last time I felt completely safe. You know that feeling when you're a kid, where you don't have to worry about anything because the adults have everything handled? Richard nodded, though the memory was bittersweet. That vacation had been a last-ditch attempt to save his marriage with Claire, and it had failed spectacularly. They'd fought every night after Tommy went to bed, their voices rising until Claire would storm out to walk on the beach. But during the days, they'd managed to create the illusion of family happiness for their son. I draw the lighthouse because it represents that feeling, Tommy continued. Safety, guidance, something permanent in the middle of chaos. He glanced at Richard. Which is ironic, considering how nothing about my life has been permanent since then. I'm sorry, Richard said, and he realized he'd been saying those words a lot over the past 3 weeks. But he was also learning that apologies, while necessary, weren't enough on their own. You don't have to keep apologizing, Tommy said. What I need to know is what you're going to do differently going forward. It was a fair question, and one Richard had been wrestling with since their first coffee shop conversation. Over the past weeks, they'd fallen into a routine of sorts. Dinner twice a week, weekend visits to museums, or just walking around the city. Long phone conversations about everything from Tommy's college applications to Richard's memories of his own father. I want to be consistent, Richard said. Not the kind of father who shows up when it's convenient or when I'm feeling guilty. The kind who's just there. Tommy finished shading a particularly complex wave and looked up at the real lake. That's what scares me, he said quietly. What if you try for a while and then decide it's too hard? What if you get bored with playing dad and go back to your normal life? The fear in his son's voice was raw and honest, and Richard recognized it is the voice of a child who had been abandoned too many times to trust easily. I can't promise I'll be perfect, Richard said. I've never been good at the daily stuff, remember? Your mom left me because I worked too much and paid attention too little. But I can promise that I won't disappear again. Even if I mess up, even if we fight, even if this gets complicated, I won't disappear. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the lake met the sky. The Garcias want to adopt me, he said finally. Richard felt his stomach drop. What? They told me last week. They want to make it permanent. Give me their name? Help me with college. Tommy's voice was carefully neutral. They're good people, they love me. Richard struggled to process this information. The Garcias had been Tommy's foster family for 6 months, longer than any of his previous placements. Richard had met them briefly when picking Tommy up for dinner. Maria Garcia was a nurse. Her husband Carlos worked for the city's parks department. Their small house was warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds and smells of a real family. What? Did you tell them? Richard asked. I told them I needed time to think about it. Tommy turned to face Richard directly. Because I need to know what you're offering. Are you asking me to come live with you? Are you asking to be my father again, officially? Or are you just asking to be someone who takes me to dinner twice a week? The question hung in the air between them, and Richard realized at this moment, sitting on a park bench overlooking Lake Michigan, was when he had to decide who he wanted to be for the rest of his life. I'm asking you to let me be your father, Richard said. Not the way I was before, but the way I should have been all along. I want to help you apply to colleges. I want to fight with you about curfews. I want to teach you how to drive stick. Shift and worry about you dating and be there when you graduate. Tommy's eyes were bright, and Richard couldn't tell if it was from emotion or just the wind off the lake. I want legal custody, Richard continued. I want you to have my name if you want it, or keep the name you have if that feels better. I want to pay for college, not because I'm trying to buy your forgiveness, but because that's what fathers do for their children. I want all of it, Tommy. The whole complicated, messy, wonderful thing. Tommy was quiet for so long that Richard began to worry he'd said too much, pushed too hard. But then his son closed his sketchbook and turned to face him fully. The Garcias are good people, Tommy said again, but they're not my father. Richard felt something unlock in his chest, a tightness he'd been carrying for 18 years finally beginning to ease. There's going to be paperwork, Tommy said, his voice taking on a practical tone that reminded Richard painfully of Claire. Legal stuff? The state has to approve transferring custody, especially to someone who's never been in my official records. I have lawyers, Richard said. Good ones. And I'm still going to be angry sometimes about the years we lost, about having to grow up too fast, about all of it. I know. And I might not call you Dad right away. That's going to take time. I understand. Tommy nodded, then surprised Richard by leaning against his shoulder. a gesture so natural and unconscious that it transported Richard back to Saturday mornings when Tommy was small, curled up next to him while they watched cartoons. "Okay," Tommy said quietly. "Let's try." As they sat together watching the sailboats navigate the choppy water, Richard realized that his son had just given him the greatest gift imaginable, a second chance to get fatherhood right, not a do-over, because they couldn't erase the lost years, but an opportunity to build something new and real from the foundation of love that had somehow survived despite everything. The lighthouse in Tommy's drawings had always represented safety and guidance. Now Richard understood that he was being asked to become that lighthouse for his son, not perfect, not flashy, but steady and reliable, and always there when the storms came. He was ready for the job. 6 months later, Thomas Richard Hartwell graduated from his Chicago high school with a scholarship to the Art Institute of Chicago. In the audience, Richard sat next to Maria and Carlos Garcia, who had become not rivals but extended family, understanding that love multiplies rather than divides. The lighthouse drawing, both the original from 18 years ago and the copy that had brought them back together, now hung side by side in Richard's Manhattan office, reminders that sometimes the most important business is the kind that can't be measured in profit margins. And in his desk drawer, Richard kept every sketch Tommy had made during their rebuilding year, evidence of a relationship that had been lost and found, broken and mended, creating something stronger in the places where it had once been fractured.